Have you ever felt like the world is moving fast, but not always in the right direction? Like truth is being redefined, responsibility is being avoided, and something important is slowly being lost. This channel exists for people who feel that tension and want to understand it. Here, we explore what the Bible teaches about influence, responsibility, and moral drift, and how ancient truths still speak directly to the world we're living in now. This isn't about fear, it's not about outrage, and it's not about perfection. It's about awareness, personal responsibility, and choosing to live deliberately in a drifting world. If you're spiritually curious, concerned about where the world is headed, or simply trying to become a better person who helps others do the same, you're in the right place. Because the world is always being shaped. Choose carefully what you're shaping it with. We look around at the state of the world and think, something feels off. We have more technology than ever, more information, more connection, and yet more division, more anxiety, more confusion about what's right and wrong. So the question is, who is really running the world? And more importantly, what role do you and I play in it? Now, when people hear that question, they often think about governments, corporations, or powerful elites. And yes, those things matter. But the Bible points us to something deeper, something far more personal. In the book of Romans, it says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." That verse quietly reveals something powerful. There is a pattern to this world, and it shapes people whether they realize it or not. The world doesn't just rule through laws or money, it rules through ideas, values, and influence. Through what we normalize, through what we celebrate, through what we tolerate. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Every single one of us is already an influencer. Not just celebrities, not just people with millions of followers. Your words influence. Your reactions influence. Your silence influences. Jesus once said, "You are the light of the world." He didn't say, "You might be," or "You could be someday." He said, "You are," which means whether we like it or not, we are shaping the world around us, for good or for bad. Now, the Bible also talks about a struggle that isn't just physical, but spiritual. A battle over hearts, minds, and truth. And when you look honestly at the world today, you can see it. Truth is treated as optional. Self-interest is praised over self-sacrifice. People are encouraged to look inward, not upward. The danger isn't that people are becoming evil overnight. The danger is that the small compromises are becoming normal. And that's how influence works. Quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. So what can one person really do? A lot more than you think. Influence doesn't start with changing the world. It starts with changing yourself. It starts with choosing integrity when no one is watching. Choosing kindness when anger would be easier. Choosing truth when lies are more convenient. The Bible says, "Whoever is faithful in little things is faithful in much." When you grow in character, clarity, and compassion, your influence expands naturally. People notice peace in a chaotic world. They notice conviction in a culture of compromise. They notice hope when everything feels heavy. And that kind of influence spreads, one conversation at a time, one decision at a time, one transformed life at a time. But here's the key question I want you to sit with. Are you being shaped by the world, or are you helping shape it? Because the world doesn't just go wayward on its own. It goes wayward when good people stop paying attention, when truth is softened, when responsibility is outsourced. Change doesn't begin with outrage. It begins with awareness and then action. So here's my invitation to you. Start paying attention to the messages you consume, the values you're absorbing, the example you're setting. Ask yourself, am I contributing to the problem or to the healing? And if you feel that stirring inside you, that sense that things could be better, that people could be better, that you could be better, that's not an accident. That's a calling. If you want to be part of changing the direction of the world, it starts with choosing to live differently on purpose. If this message resonates with you, stay connected. Reflect on it. Share it with someone who's been feeling the same concern, because the world will always be influenced. The only question is, by whom? And why not let it start with us? If you like, next I can, asterisk, break this into a series of videos. Asterisk, add Bible verse overlays time for Heijen. Asterisk, rewrite it slightly for short form clips. Asterisk, adjust theology depth, more subtle, or more explicit. Just tell me what you want next. That is brilliant, but I forgot to mention that it needs to include the entire chapter 6 of Genesis to be broken down, relating it to the very interesting points you made in the script. I'm really glad that resonated with you. Thank you for trusting me with something this meaningful. Below is a reworked, fully verbatim, Heijen-ready script that weaves the entire Genesis chapter 6 into the message, breaking it down clearly, tying it directly to who rules the world, influence, moral drift, and personal responsibility without sounding preachy or overwhelming. It's written to feel calm, intimate, thoughtful, and quietly persuasive, exactly for a spiritually curious YouTube audience. This version runs about 5-6 minutes, which is realistic given the depth of Genesis 6. If you want a strict 5 cut, I can tighten it next. Heijen, video script, verbatim. Who really rules the world? A lesson from Genesis chapter 6. Have you ever felt like the world is moving fast, but not always in the right direction? Like truth is being redefined, responsibility is being avoided, and something important is slowly being lost. This channel exists for people who feel that tension and want to understand it. Here, we explore what the Bible teaches about influence, responsibility, and moral drift, and how ancient truths still speak directly to the world we're living in now. This isn't about fear, it's not about outrage, and it's not about perfection. It's about awareness, personal responsibility, and choosing to live deliberately in a drifting world. If you're spiritually curious, concerned about where the world is headed, or simply trying to become a better person who helps others do the same, you're in the right place. Because the world is always being shaped. Choose carefully what you're shaping it with. When you look at the world today, it's hard not to feel that something has gone wrong. Violence feels normalized, truth feels flexible, and goodness often feels outnumbered. What's unsettling is that this isn't new. In fact, the Bible describes a world very much like ours. In Genesis chapter 6, we read, "Now when men started to grow in number on the surface of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of the true God began to notice that the daughters of men were beautiful. So they began taking as wives all whom they chose. Then Jehovah said, 'My spirit will not tolerate man indefinitely, because he is only flesh. Accordingly, his days will amount to 120 years.' The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and afterward. During that time, the sons of the true God continued to have relations with the daughters of men, and these bore sons to them. They were the mighty ones of all times, the men of fame. Consequently, Jehovah saw that man's wickedness was great on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only bad all the time. Jehovah regretted that he had made men on the earth, and his heart was saddened. So Jehovah said, 'I am going to wipe men whom I have created off the surface of the ground, man together with domestic animals, creeping animals, and flying creatures of the heavens, for I regret that I have made them.' But Noah found favor in the eyes of Jehovah. This is the history of Noah. Noah was a righteous man. He proved himself faultless among his contemporaries. Noah walked with the true God. In time, Noah became father to 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But the earth had become ruined in the sight of the true God, and the earth was filled with violence. Yes, God looked upon the earth, and it was ruined. All flesh had ruined its way on the earth. After that, God said to Noah, 'I have decided to put an end to all flesh, because the earth is full of violence on account of them. So I am bringing them to ruin together with the earth. Make for yourself an ark from resinous wood. You will make compartments in the ark and cover it with tar inside and outside. This is how you will make it. The ark should be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. You will make a window for light for the ark, 1 cubit from the top. You should put the entrance of the ark in its side and make it with a lower deck, a second deck, and a third deck. As for me, I am going to bring flood waters upon the earth to destroy from under the heavens all flesh that has the breath of life. Everything on the earth will perish, and I am establishing my covenant with you, and you must go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you, and bring into the ark 2 of every sort of living creature in order to preserve them alive with you, a male and a female, of the flying creatures according to their kinds, the domestic animals according to their kinds, and all creeping animals of the ground according to their kinds. 2 of each will go in there to you to preserve them alive. For your part, you are to collect and take with you every kind of food to eat, to serve as food for you and for the animals. And Noah did according to all that God had commanded him. He did just so. Genesis 6 opens with humanity growing in number, progress increasing, and influence spreading. On the surface, things look successful. But then comes a sobering shift. It says that the wickedness of mankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil continually. Notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say everyone was evil all the time in obvious ways. It says the direction of people's thoughts had changed. That's influence. Genesis 6 shows us that the world isn't ruled first by armies or governments, but by what people allow to shape their hearts and minds. Values drift. Standards erode. What was once unthinkable becomes acceptable. And eventually, corruption feels normal. Then the chapter says something deeply revealing. The earth was corrupt in God's sight and full of violence. Corruption always leads to violence, not just physical violence, but relational violence, emotional violence, moral violence. When truth is lost, people suffer. Now here's the part many people misunderstand. God isn't portrayed as angry without reason. He's portrayed as grieved. Genesis 6 says God's heart was filled with pain. Why? Because humanity was destroying itself through the misuse of influence. And yet, right in the middle of this broken world, we're introduced to one man, Noah. It says, "But Noah found favor in the eyes of Jehovah." Not because Noah was famous, not because he was powerful, but because he chose to walk differently while surrounded by corruption. That's critical. Noah didn't change the world by force. He changed it by refusing to be shaped by it. Genesis 6 tells us that Noah was righteous and blameless in his generation. In other words, he stood out not because he was perfect, but because he was intentional. And here's where this chapter becomes about us. Genesis 6 is not just a story about judgment. It's a warning about influence and a call to responsibility. The world went wayward, not overnight, but gradually, through compromised thinking, through unchecked desires, through silence from those who knew better. And the same question echoes today. Are we being shaped by the world, or are we shaping it? Because like Noah, every one of us lives in a generation defined by pressure, distraction, and moral confusion. And like Noah, we still have a choice. Influence doesn't start with followers. It starts with faithfulness. With what you allow into your mind. With how you treat people when no one is watching. With whether you stand for truth quietly, consistently, and courageously. Genesis 6 ends with God giving Noah instructions not just to save himself, but to preserve life. That's the heart of influence for good. Not domination, not control, but preservation, healing, guidance, hope. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If someone were to write the story of this generation, would you be part of the problem or part of the preservation? Because the world is always being shaped. And the most powerful influence is not loud, it's faithful. If this message stirs something in you, don't ignore it. Pay attention to where the world is drifting. Examine where you're being shaped without realizing it, and choose deliberately to be an influence for good. Not perfectly, but purposefully. Because change doesn't start with floods. It starts with people who refuse to drift, and why not let that start with us? In part 1, we looked at Genesis chapter 6 and asked a hard question. Who really rules the world? Now, let's take it one step further. Because Genesis 6 isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror. Genesis 6 tells us that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. That doesn't mean people woke up planning evil. It means their thinking had been reshaped. What they desired, what they excused, what they ignored, all slowly changed. Does that sound familiar? Today, we live in a world where truth is called personal, morality is called restrictive, and self-control is often treated like repression. What Genesis 6 shows us is this. A culture doesn't collapse because people stop believing in God. It collapses because people stop believing they're accountable. The chapter says the earth became corrupt. Corruption doesn't start with chaos. It starts with compromise. Little compromises, repeated daily, until no one remembers what was right in the first place. Then comes the word violence. Violence isn't only physical. It's how people talk to each other, how they dehumanize one another, how they reduce people to labels, enemies, or obstacles. Sound like social media? Politics? Even families? Genesis 6 is not saying, look how bad they were. It's asking, do you see yourself? And then right when the chapter feels heavy, we meet Noah. Noah lived in the same world as everyone else. He saw the same corruption. He faced the same pressure. But Genesis 6 says Noah walked with God. Not talk about God, not argued online about God. He walked with God. That means daily alignment, daily humility, daily resistance to drift. Noah didn't change the culture by shouting at it. He changed it by not becoming it. That's the parallel we miss today. We think influence requires volume. Genesis says it requires faithfulness. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The world doesn't need more outrage. It needs more people like Noah. People who choose integrity when it costs them. People who build instead of burn. People who prepare, not panic. Genesis 6 ends with an ark being built while everyone else carried on as normal. That's how moral collapse always looks. Life continues. Entertainment continues. Success continues. Until suddenly, it doesn't. So here's the question for our generation. What are you building while the world is drifting? Your character, your faith, your influence, or just your comfort? Genesis 6 reminds us that being right with God has never been about popularity. It's about obedience. And obedience, quietly lived, still changes the world. Pause. Softer. If this generation is written into history, will you be counted among those who drifted or those who preserved life? Because the most powerful influence isn't loud, it's faithful. In Genesis chapter 6, God gives Noah a command that seems almost unreasonable. Build an ark, not after the rain starts, not when everyone agrees, but before there's visible proof that anything is wrong. That's responsibility, that's deference, that's accountability. The ark wasn't just a boat, it was a public declaration. Every plank Noah laid said, I believe truth matters even when it's unpopular. Genesis doesn't tell us Noah tried to control others. It tells us he obeyed God, and that obedience looked like preparation. Here's what's easy to miss. The ark was built slowly, day after day, while life around him carried on as normal. People laughed. People ignored him. People assumed tomorrow would be just like today. Responsibility often looks foolish right up until it becomes necessary. The ark represents what happens when someone refuses to say, someone else will deal with it. Noah didn't wait for the world to improve. He improved himself and built accordingly. That's where this becomes personal. Because you and I are building arcs too, whether we realize it or not. Your arc might be your character, your integrity, your family, your influence. Or you might not be building anything at all. Genesis 6 reminds us that responsibility isn't reactive, it's proactive. It prepares for consequences long before they arrive. Our world is very good at warning signs, but not very good at responding to them. Moral confusion, emotional exhaustion, cultural division. These are not surprises, they are signals. Signals demand responsibility. Noah couldn't save everyone, but he could save what was entrusted to him. That's the real lesson of the ark. You are not responsible for fixing the whole world, but you are responsible for what God has placed in your care. Your choices matter. Your example matters. What you build matters. Because when the storm comes, it's too late to start building. When people hear the word judgment in the Bible, they often imagine anger, punishment, or fear. But Scripture presents judgment very differently. Judgment is not sudden, is not impulsive, and is not disconnected from human choice. In Genesis chapter 6, judgment only comes after truth is ignored repeatedly. Warnings were present, time was given, corruption was visible. Judgment in the Bible is what happens when reality finally catches up with denial. It's consequence, not cruelty. Think about it. If a culture rejects truth long enough, if accountability is dismissed, if responsibility is mocked, something has to give. Genesis 6 doesn't describe a world that didn't know better. It describes a world that stopped caring. That's the danger. Not ignorance, but indifference. And we see this pattern everywhere today. Warnings about mental health, warnings about family breakdown, warnings about moral confusion. We hear them, we acknowledge them, and then we keep going. Biblical judgment isn't God losing patience, it's God honoring human choice. If you reject truth long enough, you eventually live without its protection. That's why Noah matters again. He didn't wait for judgment to become obvious. He responded when there was still time. And that's the invitation Genesis gives us today. Pay attention to truth while it's still whispering, because the world is always being shaped. Choose carefully what you're shaping it with. The cost of moral drift. Moral drift is dangerous because it rarely feels like rebellion. It feels reasonable, comfortable, even compassionate. In Genesis chapter 6, the world didn't fall apart overnight. Life went on. Families grew. Work continued. The drift happened quietly. That's the cost of moral drift. You don't notice it until you're far from where you started. Drift doesn't ask you to reject truth outright. It just asks you to delay it. Later. Eventually. When it's convenient. Genesis 6 shows us that people didn't lose their conscience. They slowly stopped listening to it. And when conscience is ignored long enough, confusion replaces clarity. Right becomes negotiable. Wrong becomes contextual. Responsibility becomes optional. That's when cultures begin to fracture. Because moral drift always has a price and is never paid immediately. We see this today. Rising anxiety, broken trust, relationships built on emotion, not commitment. None of these are accidents. They are symptoms. The Bible doesn't describe God stepping away from humanity in Genesis 6. It describes humanity stepping away from truth. And truth, once abandoned, cannot protect what it no longer governs. Here's the part we often miss. Moral drift doesn't just affect society. It reshapes the individual. It dulls discernment, weakens conviction, and replaces purpose with distraction. That's why Noah stands out. Not because he was louder, but because he refused to drift. He paid a price too. Isolation, misunderstanding, ridicule. But he preserved what mattered. So here's the question. Genesis 6 quietly asks us, what is drifting in your life that you've been postponing dealing with? Not the world, not politics, not culture. You, because the world is always being shaped. Choose carefully why God always starts with one person. Before we talk about the world, we need to talk about influence, because none of us are neutral. When God wants to change the direction of history, He doesn't begin with systems. He begins with a person. In Genesis chapter 6, God doesn't try to repair a broken culture all at once. He starts with Noah, one man in one generation, surrounded by drift. That pattern repeats throughout the Bible. Abraham, called to walk by faith in a world driven by fear. Moses, sent to confront power with obedience. David, chosen for his heart, not his appearance. And eventually, Jesus won life that redefined what influence truly means. God doesn't underestimate the power of one faithful person. We do. Because we measure impact by numbers. Followers, reach, recognition. But Scripture measures impact by faithfulness. God's strategy has never been mass persuasion. It's been personal transformation. Noah didn't convince the world. He convinced himself to obey. That obedience preserved life. Here's where this matters for us. It's easy to believe change requires permission or position or popularity, but the Bible shows us something different. Change begins when someone decides to stop drifting. You don't need a platform to have influence. You need alignment. Alignment between belief and behavior, between conviction and action. That kind of alignment stands out quietly. People notice, questions arise, influence spreads, not because you demanded attention, but because integrity attracts it. Genesis 6 reminds us that God is not waiting for perfect people. He is waiting for willing ones. People who will take responsibility for what's in their control even when the world around them doesn't. You may feel small, outnumbered, insignificant. So did Noah, but history was shaped by his obedience, and the same principle still applies. Because the world is always being shaped. Choose carefully what you're shaping it with. Faithfulness without applause. Before we talk about the world, we need to talk about influence, because none of us are neutral. One of the hardest truths in the Bible is that faithfulness is rarely celebrated while it's happening. In Genesis chapter 6, Noah didn't have supporters. He didn't have affirmation. He didn't even have visible results. He had obedience, and obedience without applause is where faith is tested. We often imagine that if we're doing the right thing, someone will notice, encourage us, affirm us, validate us. But Scripture shows us something different. Most of the time, faithfulness looks lonely. Noah built the ark in silence, while the world carried on without concern. No recognition, no reassurance, just responsibility. Faithfulness doesn't depend on feedback. It depends on conviction. That's a difficult truth in a culture built on visibility. Likes, shares, approval. But biblical influence works differently. God does his deepest work where no one is watching. Think about it. The ark wasn't impressive while it was being built. It only mattered once the storm came. Faithfulness often feels pointless right up until it becomes essential. And that's where many people quit. Not because they stop believing, but because they stop feeling seen. Genesis 6 reminds us that obedience is not a performance. It's a posture. A decision to do what's right, even when it costs you comfort, recognition, or belonging. Noah didn't know how the story would end. He just knew what was required. That's faithfulness. So here's the question for us. Who are you becoming when no one is applauding? Because the world is always being shaped. Choose carefully what you're shaping it with. Preserving life in a distracted age. Before we talk about the world, we need to talk about influence, because none of us are neutral. The world around us is full of noise, notifications, headlines, opinions, entertainment. Distraction is everywhere, and distraction quietly shapes our lives. Genesis 6 teaches us that drift is subtle. It doesn't announce itself, it seeps in. The challenge isn't only resisting temptation, it's preserving life, integrity, and purpose when no one else is paying attention. Noah preserved life not by chasing headlines or by debating the world. He preserved life by preparing it. The ark didn't look impressive during construction. It only mattered when the storm arrived. Preservation requires patience, discipline, consistency, and it often feels invisible. But what is preserved quietly becomes essential loudly. So, how do we preserve life today? By protecting what is entrusted to us, our time, our relationships, our character, our faith. Distraction will always tempt us. Culture will always encourage drift, but your influence is preserved through intentional choices. Not every decision will be celebrated. Not every action will be recognized, but every decision matters. Every act of kindness, integrity, and discipline is a plank in your own ark. It preserves life around you and builds resilience within you. The world doesn't need more noise. It needs people who quietly do what is right. People who refuse to drift. People who refuse to ignore truth. People who preserve what matters even in distraction. Noah didn't save everyone. but he saved what was entrusted to him. That's our responsibility today, because the world is always being shaped. Choose carefully what you're shaping it with. Here's where it applies to us. Are we repeating the same story? Before we talk about the world, we need to talk about influence, because none of us are neutral. Genesis 6 shows a world drifting, slowly, quietly, while consequences build unseen. The same pattern repeats today. Distraction, moral compromise, neglected responsibility. It all starts small, but the end can be overwhelming. History doesn't just repeat itself, it echoes. The ark saved Noah and his family, but the world outside, it didn't change overnight. Similarly, modern society faces storms not always literal, but relational, spiritual, and moral. And we see it everywhere. Asterisk, communities fractured by neglect. Asterisk, families disconnected by distraction. Asterisk, individuals ignoring small truths until problems overwhelm. The question Genesis 6 asks us today: are we building our own arcs? Or are we drifting along, assuming someone else will save what matters? Drift doesn't require rebellion. It requires inaction, silence, delay, convenience. Small compromises pile up, small distractions grow, and suddenly the storm arrives. But just like Noah, we have a choice. We can align our actions with truth, preserve what matters, and influence life around us quietly, consistently, faithfully. Faithfulness is rarely visible. It often goes unnoticed, but its impact is real, long-term, and protective. Every act of integrity is a plank in your own ark. Every responsible choice creates shelter from the storms that will come. The cycles of moral drift are powerful, but so is deliberate action. Noah teaches us that one person can stop the pattern from continuing unchecked. So the question isn't whether the storm will come. It will. The question is, will you be ready? And what will you be shaping while you wait? Breaking the cycle. Before we talk about the world, we need to talk about influence, because none of us are neutral. The cycle of moral drift is powerful. It repeats in families, communities, and nations. Genesis 6 shows us the consequences. A world unprepared for the storm, despite the ark standing quietly in the midst. But the story doesn't end there. You can break the cycle, not with loud protest, not with visibility or popularity, but with small, consistent acts of faithfulness. Every choice to resist drift, every act of responsibility, every word of truth. Each one is a plank in your ark, a safeguard for yourself, your family, your community. Breaking the cycle starts with awareness. Notice the subtle compromises. Notice the distractions that steal your time and integrity. Notice the habits that erode responsibility. Awareness is the first step toward change. Next comes choice. You may feel small, overwhelmed by the storm of culture. But Noah shows us one person matters. One life committed to truth can preserve life. The final step is action. It may go unnoticed, it may be inconvenient, it may even be misunderstood. But action aligned with truth always builds an ark strong enough to withstand the storm. And here's the truth most people miss. The storm isn't the end, it's the measure of preparation. The question Genesis 6 asks today is, will you prepare, will you preserve what matters? Will you break the cycle? Faithfulness, responsibility, integrity. These are the planks, these are the foundations. And when you build them consistently, you create shelter for yourself and those around you. Because the world is always being shaped. Choose carefully what you're shaping it with.